So if you're afraid of making mistakes, you're actually making the biggest mistake of all, which is not using your language skills. Let's talk about it. So you're here, which means you want to avoid making mistakes in your language studies. Now, I have a news flash for you. If you are someone who clicked on this video because you want to avoid making mistakes in the languages that you're learning, this is not the video for you, because we're not here to talk about how to avoid making mistakes. We're here to talk about what you do when you make mistakes, because mistakes will happen. That is the reality, that we make mistakes all the time. And it's not about avoiding it. It's about literally what will you do when you make these mistakes. Now, if you watched episode 2 in this series, then you know one of the, was it episode 2? Double check. No, 1. Numero uno. So if you watched episode 1 in this series, you know that I recommended creating a mistake action plan for your language studies. And now I'm going to tell you how to do that, because this mistake action plan is going to help you overcome the fear of making mistakes a little bit each time. The first thing I want you to consider when you're creating your mistake action plan is remind yourself that mistakes are not failures. They're just data. Or we can say mistakes are failures, but it's okay to fail. Whatever helps you sleep better, whatever helps you to take action and to put less guilt on yourself. So the mistakes that you make in your language studies, the wrong words that you use, the mispronunciations that happen, the misunderstandings, all of those are data. Sometimes it's data on just needing more practice. Sometimes it's data on the things that you need to learn because you either learned them wrong or you don't actually know them, versus you making all of these assumptions based on ideas or what someone else said that they do in their language studies. This is now grounded in you and what you need in your language studies. So some things that I would think about is, what are the mistakes that you've actually made in your language studies? What are these mistakes? Why are they mistakes? Is it just a mental mistake? Like, I just didn't like it, because sometimes we consider those mistakes, but it was perfectly fine. That's the perfectionist talking, by the way. Sometimes we make mistakes and they are actually mistakes. Like we said the wrong word or used the wrong conjugation. All right, well, let's master that so we can actually make progress and use the languages we're learning, because that's the goal. So practice, make sentences, listen to the content over again, the video, the podcast, whatever it might be. Say it over again and over again if you messed up the pronunciation, so that you can get your mouth used to saying the words. That is a skill. We don't just naturally know how to say words, especially when there's a lot of sounds and sound combinations that are different than what we're used to. It's also why a lot of times when we speak languages, after a while, our brains start to hurt and our mouths start to hurt, and you're like, my jaw, my tongue, I just need a break from this. It's because it's a learned skill. It takes practice, it takes time. So you just have to keep coming back to it and giving yourself more of that repetition and exposure. And if you're hearing this for the first time and you're like, why are you doing that repetition and exposure? It's because I talked about it in the last video. If you missed it, go back and watch it. And then the most important thing is not just the sentences, not just listening to it over again or repeating things for pronunciation. It's also tracking your progress over time. The way that we can come to terms with making mistakes in our language studies is by tracking our progress, tracking the things that we do and don't do. For some people, that can help. Sometimes we have, instead of a to-do list, we have a to-done list, and you write down only the things that you did. And then if your list is blank, you can address that. What can I add to my schedule so that I actually get things done? Maybe you're tracking your wins. You have your worksheets, you have a Excel spreadsheet, you have a Notion, or you have my wonderful wins trackers, which are completely free, and you are tracking your own wins in your language studies so that you can come back to them and remind yourself, despite all the challenges that you're seeing, this is all the amazing progress that you've made in your language studies. So keep moving forward. The second thing I want you to consider when it comes to the fear of making mistakes is that the fear of failure is often more about mindset than it is about your actual skill or ability. So I want you to ask yourself, well, what am I really afraid of? This isn't like challenging yourself or trying to call yourself out. It's literally saying, if I'm afraid of failure, if I'm afraid of making mistakes, what am I really afraid of? What about making mistakes am I afraid of? What about failure am I afraid of? Take some time to write that down and explore that. So really ask yourself, what am I really afraid of? Let's say you're saying, I'm kind of afraid of not knowing the right word, right? Not saying the right word, using the right word in conversation. Okay, so what then? What are you going to do about it? And I don't mean that as a challenge. I literally mean, what are you going to do when you don't know the right words? What is your action plan for that? Why does it bother you to not know the right words? What about that is keeping you stuck? Maybe you're saying to yourself, well, I'm just afraid to sound silly, Bront'e. That's why I don't want to make mistakes. Okay, So what then? What happens when you sound silly? What are you going to do about it? And also, why does that bother you? Why does the fear of sounding silly honestly bother you? Dive in deep into why. And now the third thing I want you to consider when it comes to the fear of making mistakes is the reality that even advanced speakers and even native speakers make mistakes. We make mistakes in our own native languages all the time. But for some reason, when we make mistakes in the languages that we're learning, it becomes a whole big deal and we stress about it so much. And I say this from personal experience. So I want you to think about the times where you've made a mistake, where you forgot something in your native language. And if you watched my previous video where we talked about talking around the subject or substituting words for other words when you can't remember the one you're trying to say out loud, the times that you made a typo and how you reacted to that, positively or negatively, right? Because we need to normalize that mistakes happen. They're going to happen. They have already happened. So now what? You're not dumb. You're not silly. You're not stupid for making mistakes. And if you need me to tell you that, to validate that and say, yes, you're not any of those things, then let me be the first to tell you that you are not stupid. You are not silly. You are not dumb for making mistakes. We all make mistakes in our language studies, and that is okay. This is your permission slip to make mistakes and laugh about it. When I was learning Japanese in college, one of the strategies that I teach people in Fluency Mastery Lab, we would take the beginning of the Genki textbook. So they have all the vocabulary written out in one page, sometimes multiple pages, and we would use as many of those words as possible in one sentence. Everything made grammatical sense. Everything did not make logical sense, but we used all the words correctly. We used the grammar, the verb conjugation, the nouns, the adverbs, and the adjectives. They were all used correctly and appropriately in the sentences, but it's not something that anyone would actually say out loud. It was giving us permission to be silly and to make mistakes on purpose. And so if you need to give yourself permission to make mistakes on purpose in the languages that you're learning and to do something a little bit silly in that same way, do it. And if you need me to give you that permission, here's your permission slip. Go do it. And in the spirit of sharing mistakes, I remember in that same year of me learning Japanese, I was so excited to speak Mandarin with one of my friends. I was like, yes, I'm going to talk to her and I'm going to ask her this question that I know I have all correct and the tones are all good. And I said to her, "Ni o mao ma?" Which means, do you have fur? But what I meant to say was "Ni o mao ma," which is Mao versus Mao. Wait, let me get the angle right. So it's Mao versus Mao. So one has this tone and one has this tone. And I definitely didn't use the right one. Thankfully, the mistake I made was very mild in comparison to the mistakes that I have made and I've seen other people make way worse ones. Worse meaning I would really have to practice what I preach if I made some of these mistakes. But really the thing that I want to highlight here is that when we get into the space of reflecting on the mistakes that we made and normalizing it versus not, we keep moving forward. We just keep making progress versus if you get so caught up in the mistakes that you're making and the failures that you're having, then you might decide, you know, it's not worth it right now. I'm going to take a break. That week becomes a month, becomes a year, and then you're in the restarting languages area, which I have a whole video here on what to do when you're restarting. And one of the things that I tend to say is don't restart, just continue where you've left off. You know, there's a lot of layers to that. And usually I have conversations about that in coaching sessions, but generally this is my advice. If you're restarting language, just watch that video. If you take nothing else away from this video, I want you to remember that mistakes mean progress. Mistakes mean progress. But if you're still struggling to accept mistakes, you're feeling a little bit guilty about the decisions you're making in your language studies right now. You're feeling like, okay, I'm going to make all these changes, but what if I'm not studying enough? And you're feeling really guilty about that. Well, in the next video, we're going to talk about how to overcome that guilt, specifically around the not enough guilt. And so if you are ready to embrace mistakes in your language studies, I want you to like this video, share your own mistake story, like my cat versus fur story, in the comments. And if you want tips and strategies on that guilt for not doing enough, then you definitely want to check out the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss when that video drops, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.